Where did you get the jokes that you used during that period?
I think you steal mainly when you first start, like everybody does. You listen, you subscribe to, I suppose, like everybody did at one time or another, Billy Gleason. You read all of the gag files. You know, you can go to libraries actually and find jokes that they're still using today. You know, you watch Rowan and Martin and they're laughing now, actually, and they're doing stuff to a new audience that haven't heard the stuff. They're doing the old blackouts, the old crossovers, the old two-way jokes, three-way jokes, but you have an entirely new audience. No such thing as, you know, as an old joke. If somebody hasn't heard it, it's just as fresh. It's all in the telling. So I think when you first start, you find your material from all kinds of sources. Then finally you reach a point where you find out you can construct your own, or you can make them up, or you can find topical things and switch them around. Mainly construction, anyway.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Later you became a comedy writer. What made you turn from performing to writing?
Well, I was doing both at the same time, actually, Larry. Even when I was in radio in Omaha, I wrote most of my stuff as a disc jockey. Did a morning show, you know, for an hour and a half every morning, and you write your own stuff. You pull it out of the papers. I never actually gave up the performing for writing. It was just something else I was doing when I was on the West Coast. I wrote for Red Skelton for about 20 weeks. But I was also doing another show out there at the same time. It was just another part of it. They had a spot open. I was one of the contributing writers and wrote stuff. That was when Red was doing his hour show. And I wrote monologue stuff up front. But I was still performing at that time also. Very often I'd appear on Red's show, and I was doing a local show in California at the time. So it just went hand in hand. If you can write for yourself, it's a hell of an advantage.
That's what I wanted to ask you next. Comedy writers, in discussing their craft, use phrases like cadence, rhythm, formula jokes, non sequiturs, the basic
Sure.
tools of the profession.
Mm-hmm.
How did you learn the technique of joke construction?
I think by observing, by listening, and watching somebody else's work. You watch the comedians. I grew up, probably like you did, listening to the guys on the radio, the late 30s and the 40s. And if you listen to the show, as a matter of fact, I have at home. In college, I did a thesis on comedy at that time, where I taped excerpts from the various radio shows of the day and then tried to break them down and explain what kind of construction they were using. I take Jack Benny, who actually is a character comedian, if you want to put tags on things. Tags are always dangerous anyway. It's like, what's the difference between a comedian, a comic?
You're doing all my questions. You know that, don't you?
Well, you know, that's what you get into. People say, what are you? Are you a comedian? If you get laughs, you're a comedian. But now, if you want to say comic, wit, humorist, stand up, sit down, it doesn't really make any difference. Those are just tags that people, for some reason, like to put on somebody. But I think you learn construction by reading, watching, listening. Pretty soon you find out the formulas for jokes. You learn the construction of jokes, whether they're two-way jokes, single jokes, topping jokes, running gag jokes, change of pace jokes. That's all formula type of stuff. And that's why usually most discussions of comedy are very dull, I find, because once you try to explain comedy, it loses the magic that it is supposed to have.
Exactly. Except for the people in the business, the profession.
Sure, you can sit around and
like
write.
Like Jessel said, all comedians have a kinship. Like a woman in childbirth, because you talk about the things, and another guy digs what you're talking about. Robert Benchley, S.J. Perlman, James Thurber, and others have authored many comedy classics. What is the difference in the humor that is written to be read compared to that which is spoken?
Well, for example, Benchley always read better than he performed. I think today Benchley would probably be much more accepted than he was when he was doing those small little vignettes in movies. He was almost ahead of his time. He was doing very subtle, dry things that a lot of people didn't quite understand what he was doing. The written word gives you a chance to read it again. Perlman is awfully funny when you read him because of the vocabulary, the construction. It's difficult to tell in jokes. He forms word pictures. Fred Allen, very often, is almost funnier to read sometimes than he is to listen to because of his construction when he writes, I think. And most writing, like Benchley, Thurber, were not particularly good performers as such. Perlman is, when you on interview shows, doesn't come across half as well as he does on the paper. Even Art Buchwald, who is probably one of the best comedy writers per se and social commentators, doesn't come across in person as well as he does on the printed page. maybe the personality of the individual. It doesn't translate as well sometimes. So some things have to be read and reread and digested. I think when you do verbal comedy, you have to get to it a little quicker because the audience doesn't have the chance to mull it over and reread it. So it has to be a little more direct when you're doing a joke in front of an audience. You have to get to it fairly quickly. You can't encumber it with a lot of vocabulary.
Actually, the shortest distance between 2 points.
Generally, I think so, yeah, so it doesn't muddy it. If an audience has to sit and analyze the joke and understand and see what is he trying to say, I think it's a little difficult.
That must have been, the classic story of Herman Wouk, having written for Fred Allen. It must have been marvelous training for him to
I'm sure
get
it
the
was.
conciseness and getting right to the point.